The dry slam of the metal security gate echoed in my ears like a gunshot in the middle of the afternoon, and I knew in that exact second that something inside me had just broken forever. My hands were wet with soap, my old apron was stained with grease, and the keys to my own car were no longer in my pocket. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, with her flawless face and cell phone in hand, had just locked me in as if I were a criminal. "You're not going anywhere. My family is arriving for dinner in an hour. Hurry up, clean everything, sear the steaks, make the salad, and the dessert for 15 people, she shouted without even looking at me before hopping into her SUV, heading for the beauty salon. I, at 60 years old, stood in the middle of the kitchen trembling, understanding that once again I owned nothing, not even my freedom. The walls of that house, which I had once called home, seemed to observe me with a cruel indifference. The clock on the microwave read 4 p.m. on the dot, and time began to run like an impatient executioner. I took a deep breath, feeling the rage mix with an old, ancestral exhaustion that had settled in my bones for years. My son, David, didn't say a word. He was on the sectional sofa, pretending not to hear, wearing that dull, vacant look he had learned since marrying her. I gritted my teeth. No one came to my defense. As always, I had to carry the burden of everything. The humiliation was so daily that sometimes the silence hurt more than the shouting. That day, however, there was something different in the air. Maybe it was the weight of so much accumulated scorn, or the memory of my husband, Robert, promising me on his deathbed that he would never allow anyone to disrespect me. I thought about how I handed over this house with my own hands when I trusted that my old age would be protected by my son's love. Now I was just a shadow that cleaned, cooked, and bowed its head. I looked at the closed gate from the kitchen window and felt a tightness in my chest. It wasn't just an iron grill. It was the symbol of my confinement, my fear, and also, without them knowing it, the beginning of something neither of them would see coming. But before I continue, I want to extend a very special invitation to you. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps me see that you support me and enjoy my stories. And comment down below which city you are watching us from. Now, let's continue. I went back to the kitchen and got moving, almost by reflex. I took the meat out of the sub-zero freezer with clumsy hands. I felt the cold pierce my fingers as if reminding me how long I had felt frozen on the inside. I turned on the gas range, washed vegetables, and chopped onions while tears I didn't know if from the stinging fumes or the sadness ran down my cheeks. The smell of hot oil began to fill the room. Every sound was a lash. The knife against the cutting board, the exhaust hood roaring, the clock advancing without mercy. No one came to help. No one asked if my back hurt, if my legs could hold me up. I was invisible. While I worked, the memories began to attack me without my being able to stop them. The day David asked me to sell my condo to invest in this large family home. The day Jessica smiled, hugged me tight, promising me that I would always have my place. The day that, little by little, that place shrank until it was reduced to a converted shed at the back of the yard and a routine of a silent maid. I remembered every slight disguised as a joke, every order given in front of guests, every dinner where I served them and then ate alone in the kitchen. It was all there, accumulated at the bottom of my chest, waiting to explode. At 5:15, sweat was soaking my neck. The steaks were beginning to brown in the skillet, and the aroma mixed with the vinegar from the freshly mopped floor. I crouched down to clean under the island counter, and a wave of dizziness clouded my vision for an instant. I held onto the edge of the granite countertop, breathing slowly so as not to fall. I thought that if I fainted, no one would notice until the smoke of burnt meat filled everything. That idea produced a bitter, silent laugh inside me. Even sick, I didn't stop being useful. My son walked through the kitchen without looking at me, grabbing a bottle of water. "Hurry up," he said in a low voice, as if that excused him from his cowardice. I nodded without speaking. I had learned that words in that house only brought me more humiliation, but something inside me hardened. It was no longer just sadness. It was a dangerous calm, a stillness that precedes the most devastating storms. Outside, the sun began to set slowly, drawing long shadows in the yard like the bars of an imaginary prison. At 5:20, the first ring of the doorbell startled me. There were barely 40 minutes left until she returned from the salon, sure that she would find the old servant following orders without a peep. The guests would arrive shortly after, and the show would begin. I was still alone in the kitchen, surrounded by dishes, boiling pots, and a sweat that was no longer just physical. While I arranged the salad in a large glass bowl, I looked at my reflection in the china cabinet mirror. A woman with gray hair, a tired face, a hunched back, but my eyes were no longer the same. In them, a silent determination had been born that no one had seen yet. In that instant, I understood something with absolute clarity. That night would not be like all the others. The dinner that I, humiliated and locked in, was preparing would not just be a banquet for 15 people. It would be the stage where many masks would fall, where truths that had been buried for years under the rug of fear and convenience would be heard. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I felt it in every accelerated beat of my heart. Something was brewing, something irreversible. And when Jessica returned and crossed that gate, she wouldn't just find a set table, she would find the beginning of her own collapse. When my husband, Robert, died 8 years ago, I believed that pain could never be greater than it was that day. I was wrong, because later I understood that there are pains that don't scream, that don't kill immediately, but settle slowly in the soul and consume it like a lit candle in a closed room. It was my son who told me not to worry, that I would never be alone, that selling my small condo was the best decision so we could all live together as a real family. I trusted, as always. I sold my home, handed over my savings, signed papers I didn't fully understand, believing that a son's love was enough to protect me. At first, my daughter-in-law acted sweet. She called me Mom, made me coffee, asked for my advice. I, coming from a tough but dignified marriage, felt that perhaps destiny still had something good reserved for me. But the changes arrived without my being able to point to the exact day everything started to twist. First, it was small orders disguised as suggestions, then hurtful comments in a low voice, then the custom that I cook for everyone while they relaxed. And, when I wanted to realize it, I was no longer a guest in the house I bought. I was the unpaid employee of a household I no longer felt was mine. That afternoon, while chopping tomatoes with trembling hands, I went back to remembering each of those transformations, like someone reviewing an open wound. My room was moved to the back of the yard so they could have more privacy. My things disappeared from the living room so everything would look more modern. My name stopped being heard at the table. I was Grandma, the old lady, or simply her. I lowered my head so many times that I ended up believing I deserved to live like that. And the most painful thing of all wasn't Jessica's cruelty. It was my son's complicit silence. That silence that split me in two every day. While the meat sizzled in the pan, a memory stuck in my chest like a thorn. The night when, in front of some friends of theirs, my daughter-in-law said, laughing, that I didn't serve for much anymore, but at least she cleans well. Everyone laughed. Even David. I smiled too. I smiled so as not to cry. I smiled so as not to cause a scene. I smiled so as not to be the burden of the night. Since then, I understood that my dignity was something I had to hide, like things that make people uncomfortable are hidden. The clock advanced, and the house began to fill with an intense aroma of food. I prepared salad for 15 people, arranged the plates, polished the silverware until it shined more than my own tired eyes. Every movement cost me an excessive effort, but no one noticed. My body was no longer young. My hands were swollen from arthritis. My knees creaked when I stood up. However, there I was, following orders as if my life depended on it. Maybe it did depend on it, I thought bitterly. It depended on not becoming a complete nuisance. Outside, the doorbell began to ring more frequently. The guests arrived little by little, cheerful voices, laughter, expensive perfumes entering through the front door while I remained trapped in the kitchen, sweating in silence. I heard my son receiving Jessica's family with enthusiasm, as if he hadn't just witnessed my imprisonment an hour before. I felt a deep stab in my stomach. At what moment had I stopped being his mother to become part of the furniture? That question hit me again and again without finding an answer. While I carried a large platter toward the dining room table, I heard one of Jessica's aunts say, "This house is beautiful. You guys got so lucky." My son responded proudly, "Yes, it was a great investment." I walked behind them without anyone noticing my steps. That investment was mine, too. I wanted to scream. This house was also bought with the effort of my years, with sleepless nights, with sacrifices that now seemed to have no value. But I kept walking in silence, head down, as if I didn't exist. I took refuge for a few seconds in the bathroom to catch my breath. I leaned against the sink, looked at myself in the mirror, and barely recognized myself. The woman staring back seemed defeated, but deep in those tired eyes was a new light, a spark of something I myself didn't fully understand yet. I thought of Robert, of his firm voice telling me never to let them humiliate me. I thought of everything I had kept quiet for fear of losing my son, and for the first time in many years, I allowed myself to ask if I hadn't already lost him a long time ago. When I returned to the kitchen, the noise from the dining room was unbearable. Laughter, toasts, soft music in the background. My daughter-in-law hadn't arrived yet, but her family already occupied the house as if it were theirs forever. I kept working, putting the dessert in the refrigerator, checking again and again that everything was perfect, not out of blind obedience, but because inside me, something was preparing itself. That perfection wasn't to please her. It was the calm before a break that could no longer be avoided. With every minute that passed, I felt how the weight of the years stopped being a chain and transformed into armor. Everything I had endured, every insult, every slight, every silence from my son was accumulated there, waiting for its moment. I hadn't raised my voice yet, I still hadn't taken the decisive step, but my heart was no longer that of a submissive woman. Something was waking up in me that night, something no one in that house had foreseen. And while the guests settled in the dining room and the aroma of the banquet filled every corner, I understood, with a certainty that froze my blood and at the same time gave me strength, that house I no longer felt was mine was about to become the stage for the greatest collapse of their lives. They still believed I was just the obedient old woman as always. Didn't they know that in silence, the story had already begun to be written differently? The house, which for hours had been just a silent battlefield between my hands and exhaustion, suddenly transformed into a theater of rehearsed laughter and other people's perfumes. The dining room filled with elegant bodies, strident voices, exaggerated greetings. I observed everything from the kitchen door, holding a heavy tray as if it were a shield. No one looked me in the eye. I was part of the decor, like the paintings on the wall or the flowers on the table. I existed only to serve. The women of Jessica's family entered first, commenting on one's hairstyle, another's dress, criticizing in whispers what they didn't approve of. The men arrived with bottles of wine, laughing loudly, talking about business and money. My son moved among them with a forced smile, trying to fit in, trying to be someone he wasn't. I looked at him from afar and felt a bitter pang in my chest. That insecure boy was the same child I had held when he had nightmares. Now, he barely spoke a word to me. I began to serve the appetizers. I went plate by plate, bowing my head, listening to empty thank yous that seemed to come out of obligation. No one asked who had cooked. No one was interested in me. I heard a sister-in-law of Jessica say in a mocking tone, "Ah, no wonder everything smells so homemade. Grandma has been working hard." There was laughter. I smiled too, out of habit, out of survival, but inside me, something tensed like a rope about to snap. At 6:10, finally, I heard the unmistakable sound of the car entering the driveway. My heart skipped a beat. A minute later, her voice was heard from the living room, loud, confident, theatrical. "I'm here. Everything is ready," she shouted. She appeared in the doorway like a queen entering her palace. Perfect hair, impeccable makeup, a fitted dress. She didn't even look at me. She went straight to her family, kissed, hugged, received compliments. I kept serving, invisible, holding a hot platter that burned my hands. "I hope everything turned out impeccable," she said as she passed by me, without looking at me. I nodded in silence. I had learned that any word could become a reason for mockery or reproach. She took the floor immediately, as if she were the absolute owner of that night. She explained the menu, praised how arduous it had been to organize everything. She spoke of herself as if she had moved mountains. No one contradicted her. No one remembered that I had spent hours locked in the kitchen, sweating, trembling, obeying. We sat at the table. I occupied, as always, the farthest end, almost against the wall. From there I could see all the faces, the haughty looks of her family, the noisy toasts, the comments about trips, money, appearances. I listened in silence, chewing slowly, back straight, as my mother had taught me. Even if they humiliate you, keep your dignity. But that night, dignity weighed more than ever. My daughter-in-law used every opportunity to show off. She talked about her salon, her clients, how much her business had grown. One of the men, a cousin of hers, joked, "No wonder you have your mother-in-law working as a maid. That way you save a salary." The laughter was general. I stabbed the fork into the plate with a force I didn't recognize as my own. I felt my son lower his gaze. He said nothing. He never said anything. Then something small happened, almost imperceptible to everyone, but for me, it was like a bell tolling. One of the older women in the family, Aunt Carol, looked directly into my eyes, not with mockery, not with scorn, but with surprise, with something resembling compassion. "Did you cook all of this alone?" she asked me. The silence became uncomfortable for a second. My daughter-in-law let out an uncomfortable laugh. "Oh, sure, she likes to feel useful." I responded in a low voice. "Yes, I did it alone." I lowered my gaze again, but something in that exchange remained floating in the air. The atmosphere began to tense slowly, not because of anything obvious, but because of an awkwardness that grew like humidity on the walls. Some guests began to notice too much. The platters, the sweat on my forehead, my trembling hands, the lie that she had organized everything was starting to crack without her noticing. I continued in silence, observing, registering everything with an almost ferocious attention, every word, every gesture, every fake smile. The main course arrived at the table amidst applause and exaggerated comments. She stood up to receive praise as if she were a renowned chef. I remained seated. No one invited me to stand up with her. No one considered it necessary. While everyone ate, I heard one of my son's business partners comment loudly, "This house is impressive. You can tell there's old money here." Jessica smiled proudly. I swallowed slowly. Old money. Yes, mine too. Suddenly, without anyone expecting it, the music cut out. The silence was abrupt. My son got up to check the sound system, nervous. For a few seconds, only silverware and murmurs were heard. I took advantage of that moment to observe them one by one. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. Everyone was there for convenience, for interest, for appearances. No one was there for me. And yet, I was the one holding up, without them knowing, the foundations of that night. My daughter-in-law, annoyed by the interruption, clicked her tongue. "Something always happens when everything is going perfectly," she said with annoyance. It was then that, for the first time that night, she looked directly at me. Her eyes locked onto mine with a mixture of command and threat. I returned the gaze for just a second, the first second in years that I didn't lower my eyes. She frowned, bewildered, and looked away immediately, as if that gesture had made her uncomfortable. In that instant, I knew there was no turning back. Something had shifted, even if no one could name it yet. The dinner continued. The laughter returned little by little, but the atmosphere was no longer the same. I was still there, apparently submissive, apparently invisible, but inside, every word I heard was one more nail in a coffin that was being built without them realizing it. When I served dessert, I felt how the weight of the glances began to change. Some no longer saw me just as the useful old woman. Some were starting to look at me as something uncomfortable, like a presence that didn't fit the role assigned to it. My daughter-in-law still smiled confidently, never imagining that confidence was her greatest weakness. And while the table filled with sweets, glasses, and forced laughter, I understood that the foundations of that perfect family were already cracked. They just didn't know it yet. But the collapse had begun. The dessert was served amidst lukewarm applause and exaggerated praise, but the air was already charged with a tension that didn't dissipate with sugar or expensive wine. I walked between the table and the kitchen in silence, collecting plates, listening to fragments of conversations that spoke of trips, investments, of brilliant futures that seemed drawn only for them. No one mentioned my name. No one asked how I felt. I remained invisible, and yet, for the first time, that invisibility was beginning to be my greatest strength. While I rinsed glasses in the kitchen, I felt in the pocket of my apron the familiar rustle of the papers I carried with me always. I touched them instinctively, like someone making sure something valuable is still in its place. No one knew I kept them. No one suspected that those documents, kept for years out of fear, prudence, or misunderstood love, were much more than simple sheets of paper. They were evidence. Evidence of decisions made behind my back, of betrayals signed with ink and fake smiles. I remembered the day David asked me to sign certain papers just as a formality. I was still dazed by Robert's death, vulnerable, trusting blindly. I signed without reading carefully, believing it was something temporary. Years later, by chance, I discovered that those papers were not a simple formality. They were the complete cession of rights, the silent renunciation of what also belonged to me. I didn't say anything then. Instead, I made copies. I learned to be quiet and to wait. From the kitchen door, I observed how Jessica laughed with her cousins, gesturing with confidence, as if the entire world were at her feet. She talked about expanding the salon, opening another branch, investing big. My son nodded beside her with a glass in his hand and a tired look. I knew that look. It was that of someone who had yielded too many times and no longer knew how to go back. He didn't know that I had discovered what they were hiding, either. Aunt Carol looked at me again from the table with discretion, as if she wanted to say something but didn't dare. Her husband murmured something near her, and both looked away when they noticed I was observing them. They weren't bad people, I thought. They were just there, on a comfortable night, not wanting to see the injustice that breathed in that house. I understood them. For years, I too had pretended not to see too many things, so as not to break the little I had left of a family. I returned to the kitchen with hands slightly trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the growing certainty that the truth had a weight impossible to hold for much longer. The documents in my pocket seemed to burn. I had learned in silence about accounts, money movements, legal decisions that one day could come to light. I, the useless old woman, had read, asked, investigated when everyone thought I only cleaned floors and cooked. My husband used to say that patience was a form of intelligence. In life, he had handled numbers, contracts, agreements that I barely understood. Before dying, he left me clues without knowing it. I tied them together over the years, with sleepless nights, with a fear that grew fainter. What that family celebrated as their prosperity was built on silences that were too fragile, and I knew those silences better than anyone. When I returned to the dining room with the coffee, I heard my daughter-in-law say with arrogance, "Soon we'll buy another property. This house is already too small for us." I felt a knot in my throat. This house that I had helped build with my savings, with my trust, was still being called theirs as if I had never existed. My son smiled nervously. Someone asked in whose name the next purchase would be. She responded without hesitating, "In our name, of course." The laughter exploded again. I served the coffee calmly. Every cup I placed on the table was for me, like placing a piece on an invisible board that only I saw complete. No one suspected my slow movements, my prolonged silences. They thought they were the fruit of age. No one imagined that in reality, I was following a rhythm I had learned to respect, the rhythm of waiting. My daughter-in-law then spoke of me in the third person, as if I weren't in the same room. "Good thing she can still help in the kitchen. That way she earns her keep," she said with a smile loaded with scorn. I remained standing, holding the empty tray. I felt something tear inside. It wasn't sadness. It was the last layer of fear peeling away. I set the tray on the sideboard with a dry sound. Some looked at me. She didn't. My son avoided my eyes once more. I knew in the deepest part of me that I couldn't keep waiting for him to defend me. That defense would never arrive. I had to build it myself, with my own hands, as I had built so many things in my life. I felt the weight of the years settle on my shoulders, but no longer as a useless burden, but as a history that backed me. In the distance, I heard loud laughter, the clinking of glasses, words loaded with vanity. And in the middle of that scene, I understood that true fragility wasn't in my tired body, but in the arrogance of those who believed themselves untouchable. No one suspected that behind that silent woman serving coffee, there was a latent truth waiting for the precise instant to come to light. That night, while everyone celebrated, I confirmed something I had been sensing for a long time. The story they were writing without me could also be rewritten. And when that happened, there would be no turning back. The calm they enjoyed was just the tranquil surface of an abyss that was about to open beneath their feet. The coffee was in almost every cup when the thing that marked the point of no return happened. I was getting ready to return to the kitchen when my daughter-in-law, with that sweet voice she used only to humiliate better, asked for attention. "Before the final toast, I want to say something," she announced, standing up with her glass raised. Everyone went quiet. My son looked at her with a mixture of pride and nervousness. I remained motionless against the wall, back straight by pure defensive instinct. "This night has been perfect," she began, scanning the table with a triumphant smile. "Everything has turned out just as I planned. The house, the food, the family gathered. This is how things should be done when one knows how to organize their life. Several heads nodded. I felt each of her words hit me like an invisible slap. Then, without losing her smile, she turned her face slightly toward me. Well, almost everything. You always have to stay on top of certain people, she said, making a vague gesture with her hand in my direction. Some nervous laughter was heard. She didn't stop there. She took a small step toward where I was. Imagine if I didn't take charge to ensure everything was done on time. With age, we already know, things get forgotten, they move slow, they drop everything. The laughter became clearer now, more comfortable. I felt something very deep inside me tear with a dry, invisible sound. My son lowered his head. He didn't react, didn't say anything. His silence hurt me more than her words. Then she added with a light laugh, "But well, that's what she's here for, right? To help in whatever she still can." Her glass clinked with one of her cousins. The toast continued as if nothing happened. I remained standing, with my heart pounding in my ears. For an instant, the world became blurry. I saw tables, glasses, faces contracting in laughter, and in the middle of it all, my reflection in the glass of a window. A 60-year-old woman, erect, with eyes full of something that was no longer sadness. That was the exact moment I understood that if I didn't speak now, I never would, that if I didn't set a limit that night, I would die alive inside that house. I felt a tingling run through my arms. The weight of the years, the silences, the humiliations settled inside me like a new force. I took a step forward, just one. But that step weighed more than all the ones I had taken in the last 8 years. "Is something wrong?" she asked, annoyed upon noticing the movement. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at my son for the first time in a long time. I looked at him as when he was a child, as when he depended on me to survive. He looked away, and there I understood that I was alone, completely alone, but I also understood that I no longer needed anyone to speak. I took a deep breath. The dining room fell silent. "I was just going to clear the cups," I said finally, with a calm I didn't know I possessed. Several people let out a sigh, relieved that there wasn't a scene. She smiled, satisfied, believing she had imposed herself again. I returned to the kitchen with firm hands, but inside my heart beat like a drum in battle. While I washed the cups, my thoughts raced with ferocious clarity. I remembered every document saved, every signature, every figure, every conversation overheard. I remembered the night I discovered that Jessica had put the house up as collateral without telling anyone. I remembered the messages I found by chance on an old, forgotten tablet. Everything was there waiting. I had waited out of fear, out of misunderstood love, out of hope that my son would react. That hope had just died in the dining room amidst laughter and drinks. It was then that I made the decision that would change my life. I didn't do it with rage. I did it with an icy serenity. That night would not just be the stage for another humiliation. It would be the beginning of the end for those who had built their power by stepping on me. I didn't know yet exactly how it would all play out, but I knew I wouldn't stay silent again. From the kitchen, I heard them continue celebrating. Someone put music on again. The laughter returned with force. It was as if the world continued spinning, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I dried my hands with the same stained apron I had used all afternoon. I folded it carefully and left it on the table. That simple gesture was for me like taking a chain off my body. I went back to the dining room slowly. I wasn't carrying trays anymore. I wasn't carrying anything in my hands. Some looked at me with strangeness. My daughter-in-law frowned. She didn't understand why I was standing in front of the table without serving or clearing. I looked her straight in the eye without lowering my head. She looked away first. Before I could open my mouth, I felt I should give myself a second to look at that scene. For the last time, from the place I had occupied for years, I saw my son hunched in his chair, small. I saw my daughter-in-law surrounded by laughter that wasn't out of love. I saw a family supported by a lie that I knew better than anyone. Then I spoke, but only inside myself. "I've reached my limit." But before I continue, tell me here in the comments what you think of this story so far and what you would do in my place. Don't leave the video, because what comes next will give you goosebumps. When my lips closed again after that thought, I knew there was no turning back. I still hadn't pronounced a single truth aloud. No one yet imagined how close the collapse was, but the decision was already made, and it was definitive. I, the submissive old woman, the shadow that cleaned in silence, had ceased to exist that night. My daughter-in-law watched me with impatience. "What are you waiting for?" she said. Her tone had a new note of irritation. I looked at her with a tranquility that seemed to defy her. "Nothing," I responded. And in that single word went all the weight of what was to come. The guests resumed their conversations, believing everything had returned to normal, but I knew there was no normal possible anymore. Something had crossed an invisible line. Something had definitely awakened in me. And although they kept laughing, without suspecting it, they were already walking toward the moment that would change their lives forever. The music kept playing, the laughter rose above the glasses, and I crossed the dining room as if walking among shadows that no longer belonged to me. I returned to my room at the back of the yard with slow, measured steps. No one followed me. No one worried about knowing where I was going. For them, I had just returned to my place. I closed the door carefully and leaned my back against the wood, feeling for the first time in years that the tremor running through my body wasn't from fear, but from a strange, contained euphoria. I pulled out from under the mattress the small brown folder I had kept hidden for so long. It was worn, bent at the corners, stained by the years. Inside slept, ordered with obsessive precision, the copies of the documents I had gathered in silence. Deeds, contracts, bank statements, printed text messages, everything I discovered by accident one day and then, piece by piece, began to understand. I ran my fingers over the sheets as if touching something alive. There was the truth they believed buried. I remembered clearly the day I found the first proof. It was an afternoon when my daughter-in-law asked me to look for an unimportant file in the home office. I opened drawers, organized papers, until a name stopped my heart. Mine. My name was printed where it shouldn't be. What followed were figures I didn't understand immediately, and a signature my son's on a document I never remembered seeing. That day I felt a cold so deep I thought I would faint. No one knew I had read that. No one. Over the months, I gathered more pieces, listening to half conversations, reviewing papers no one looked at again, keeping copies in silence. I discovered that the house they called theirs wasn't legally complete, that there was money that left an account in my name without my consent, that they used my former property as collateral without informing me. I discovered hidden debts, risks no one imagined. I discovered, above all, that the prosperity they bragged about so much was held up by a fragile web of deceit. That night, holding that folder in my hands, I knew I could no longer be their silent accomplice. My son had allowed too many things. My daughter-in-law had gone too far. I myself had endured too much. I took a sheet at random, read it once more, understood it better than ever, and in that instant, I knew what my first step would be. I put the folder inside a discreet bag I had prepared a long time ago, without knowing exactly when I would use it. I looked at myself in the mirror for a second. The woman staring back was no longer the same one who had started cooking that afternoon. There was a hardness in her eyes I didn't know in myself. I smoothed my hair with firm hands and went out again toward the main house. When I entered the dining room, no one stood up, no one interrupted the music. I walked to my chair and sat down without saying a word. My daughter-in-law watched me with suspicion from the head of the table. Something in me had changed, and she perceived it even if she couldn't name it. "Did you finish everything?" she asked with annoyance. I nodded slowly. "Yes, everything is done," I responded. That phrase was loaded with a double meaning that only I understood. The guests began to disperse around the living room, some already a bit dizzy from the alcohol. Aunt Carol approached me cautiously. "I hope you didn't get too tired," she said in a low voice. I smiled barely. "I'm used to it," I replied. She seemed to want to say something else, but held back. In her eyes, there was a new uneasiness. Maybe she already sensed that that night wouldn't end like all the others. My son stood up to toast again. He talked about family, effort, the future. His words sounded hollow, as if he had memorized them so as not to think. I watched him without blinking. Every sentence of his increased in me a mixture of pain and determination. He didn't know that I already knew the magnitude of everything. He still believed his mother was ignorant of his mistakes. That illusion would soon break. Jessica interrupted the toast with a loud laugh. "Well, now that everyone has eaten, I think the lady can clear everything and let us continue the night in peace," she said, without looking directly at me. Those words, which before would have reduced me to silence, this time passed through me without touching me. I remained seated. I looked at her with the most dangerous calm I had felt in my life. She frowned. "Didn't you hear?" she added, annoyed. It was then that I responded, "Yes, I heard." My voice came out low, but clear. An uncomfortable silence spread around. No one was used to hearing me talk back. She sighed with disdain. "Then hurry up," she said. I didn't get up. I felt several guests beginning to observe the scene with attention. My son looked at me confused. "Not today," I said finally. Just 2 words. But those 2 words fell on the table like a heavy object. My daughter-in-law opened her eyes in disbelief. "What do you mean, not today?" she retorted with a tone that was starting to lose control. I didn't answer her immediately. I took my time. I drank a sip of water, let the silence do its work. "Today I'm not going to keep pretending," I added. Then, the gazes locked onto me, some surprised, others uncomfortable, others frankly curious. My son began to turn pale. I recognized in his face the first sign of true fear. My daughter-in-law laughed nervously. "Don't start with your things in front of my family," she said. I kept my gaze fixed on hers. "Your family deserves to know who really supports this house," I responded. The murmur rose immediately. Several people exchanged looks. I felt the tremor run through me inside, but I didn't back down. That which I had kept for so many years was already pushing to get out. I still hadn't unfolded the documents, hadn't pronounced the numbers, or the names, or the hardest truths, but the secret that could destroy everything had already crossed the threshold of silence. What was about to happen no longer depended on fear. It depended solely on my decision to advance to the end. And that night, without them understanding it yet, the truth was already seated at the table. The silence that settled in the dining room after my words was so thick it seemed you could cut it with a knife. No one moved, no one laughed. The faces that minutes before were inflamed with wine, pride, and vanity now showed a mixture of bewilderment and expectation. My daughter-in-law was the first to react. She gave a forced laugh, too loud, too fast. "Don't be dramatic," she said, bringing her hand to her glass. "You always invent things to get attention." I didn't respond immediately. I felt my heart beating forcefully against my ribs, as if it wanted to run out, but my legs remained firm. For the first time in years, I was standing in the middle of everyone, without feeling shame. My son looked at me with eyes wide open, as if he were seeing a stranger. In his look, there was something I had never seen before. Dread. "What are you talking about, Mom?" he asked with a thread of a voice. His tone was almost pleading. I looked at him with a sadness that pierced me from side to side. I thought of the boy he was, the man he didn't know how to be. "I'm talking about this house," I responded. "About this money, about this life that you act like was born from nothing." My daughter-in-law slammed the table with the palm of her hand. "Enough! You are ruining the night!" she screamed. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Aunt Carol brought a hand to her chest. I took a deep breath, very deep. The moment had arrived, and there was no turning back. I took the bag I had left next to my chair and opened it in front of everyone. I took out the brown folder with a slow, deliberate gesture. The rustle of paper resonated in the silence. Several gazes locked onto my hands. My son stood up abruptly. "What is that?" he asked, changing color. I left the folder on the table, right in front of him and in front of my daughter-in-law. "This," I said with a firm voice, "is what you believed buried forever." Jessica tried to snatch it from me, but I pulled my hand back quickly. "Don't touch it," I warned. My tone admitted no reply. She stood paralyzed, surprised by an authority she had never heard in me. I opened the folder slowly. The first sheet came into view, with signatures, dates, stamps. Several guests instinctively leaned forward to see better. "This is the deed of transfer of my old condo," I began, "signed by my son 8 years ago when his father had just died. A document that was never explained to me, that was never given to me complete." I turned the page. "This other one is the lien where you put this house in your names using my property as backing, without my informed consent." Murmurs were heard around the table. Someone whispered, "How?" My daughter-in-law went pale. My son grabbed the back of the chair as if he were going to crumble. "Mom, that's not right," he stammered. I looked at him with a firmness that left him breathless. "Quiet," I said. and for the first time in his life, he obeyed me. I took out another document. Here are the movements of the account in my name. Wire transfers made when I didn't even know how to use a computer. Money that disappeared. Money you used to grow, to invest, to buy. I looked at the guests, one by one. This prosperity you brag about so much is also built with what you took from me. The murmur became an uncomfortable rumble. Some stood up from their chairs, others avoided looking at us. Jessica was trembling but tried to maintain composure. "That's a lie," she screamed. "Those papers are worthless." I smiled with a serenity that even froze my own blood. "They are worth enough to put this house at risk," I responded. My son took a step toward me. His eyes were full of panic. "Mom, it wasn't like that. I believed." He stuttered. "You believed it was best for everyone," I completed. "You believed I would never discover it. You believed I would keep being the old lady who cleans in silence?" I saw him shrink before my words. I had never seen him so small. Then I showed the last sheet, not the most important in legal terms, but the most painful. "And here," I said with a voice broken for a second, "are messages. Conversations between you two, where you make fun of me, where you say that as long as I'm alive, the house can't be sold completely, where you plan what to do with me when I'm no longer useful." A moan escaped someone's throat. My daughter-in-law let out a stifled scream. "You can't prove that," she shrieked. I rested the paper on the table. "It's written in your own words," I answered. Aunt Carol brought both hands to her mouth. "My God," she murmured. Her husband lowered his head. The dining room erupted into contained chaos. Some guests began to argue in low voices. Others stood up looking for an exit. Others demanded explanations. "Is this true?" one of the men asked my son. He didn't answer. His face was decomposed, hands trembling, mouth open without emitting a sound. His silence was the confirmation. My daughter-in-law, cornered, began to scream incoherently. "You owe us everything. You lived here for free for years. We gave you a roof, food. We deserve it," she shrieked with bulging eyes. I looked at her with an almost cruel calm. "You didn't give me anything that wasn't mine from the beginning," I told her. "And what you took from me, you are going to return one way or another." My son fell to his knees beside the chair as if his legs had stopped holding him. "Mom, please," he pleaded. I looked at him with a mixture of ancient love and infinite exhaustion. "I gave you my whole life," I answered him, "and you decided to hand me over to humiliation." The guests no longer hid their discomfort. Two of them were openly discussing the legal implications. Another spoke of withdrawing from future business deals with Jessica. The image of perfection crumbled before my eyes like a building without foundations. And in the middle of that chaos, I felt strangely calm, as if for the first time the air entered clean into my lungs. Aunt Carol approached me with wet eyes. "Forgive me, we didn't know," she whispered. I barely nodded. I didn't need more apologies. Not anymore. My daughter-in-law collapsed in a chair, defeated by the scandal, by the looks, by the fear. She wasn't screaming anymore. She cried in silence, like an actress fallen from the stage. My son remained on his knees without daring to touch me, and I understood, observing that impossible scene, that the truth had fulfilled its first function, destroying the lie. The dinner had ended. The farce had ended. And what would come next would be even more devastating. The house remained wrapped in a dense murmur, as if every wall now carried the weight of the truths just spoken. The guests began to leave in silence, one after another, with clumsy excuses and elusive glances. Some avoided crossing my eyes, others gave me a final compassionate look before leaving. The heavy front door opened several times that night, but no longer to lock anyone in, but to let shame escape. Every click of the latch resonated like a final seal on a reputation that was collapsing. My daughter-in-law didn't move from the chair. Her mascara was running, shoulders slumped, hands clenched against her dress. I had never seen her like this, small, disarmed, without words. My son was still on his knees, so pale he looked like a shadow of himself. I remained standing with the folder in front of me, feeling a strange, almost unreal calm. The chaos no longer reached me inside. Too much time had passed waiting for this moment. When the last guest closed the door, the silence was absolute. The music had been turned off. The dining room, which hours before was full of fake laughter and raised glasses, now seemed like an empty stage after the show. My daughter-in-law was the first to break the silence. "What do you want?" she asked with a broken voice. "Money? The house? For us to leave?" Her tone was no longer arrogant. It was that of someone who, for the first time, had no control whatsoever. I advanced slowly until I was in front of her. "I want justice," I responded. "Not cheap revenge. Justice." She let out a nervous laugh, almost hysterical. "And you think with those papers you can destroy us?" I looked at her firmly. "I don't think so," I answered. "I know so." My son stood up slowly, staggering. "Mom, please, let's talk," he said with desperation. I shook my head. We talked all our lives. "Today, only consequences are heard," I responded. He crumpled his face like a lost child. And in that gesture, I saw for the last time the son I had wanted to protect at any cost. I took the phone out of the bag and in front of them dialed a number I had kept for months. Jessica opened her eyes with terror. "Who are you calling?" she whispered. "A lawyer," I answered without hesitating. Her scream was sharp, torn. She jumped up and tried to snatch the cell phone. My son grabbed her by the waist to stop her. "Enough!" he shouted, for the first time raising his voice against her. I observed that scene without intervening. It was too late for sudden changes of loyalty. I hung up after a brief conversation. "Tomorrow at first light, the legal process begins," I announced. "This house is under investigation. The accounts will be audited. Everything will come to light." My daughter-in-law collapsed on the floor, crying with convulsions. "We'll lose everything," she moaned. I nodded slowly. "That happens when you steal the future of others." My son put his hands to his head. "Why didn't you speak before?" he asked between sobs. "Because before, I still believed you were capable of defending me," I answered him. Those words pierced him like a knife wound. He fell seated in a chair, defeated. That same night, the first visible consequences began. Jessica's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls she rejected out of fear. Messages that appeared one after another on the illuminated screen. Partners, family members, acquaintances. The rumor had already spread. What happened at that dinner wouldn't stay between four walls. The scandal had been born and was growing without control. I saw how every message made her shudder more, as if they were ripping layers of her old security. Hours later, the first knocks arrived at the door. They were two men in suits. I recognized them from the photos I had seen in the documents. "Process servers," my daughter-in-law screamed. My son wanted to explain himself. I limited myself to pointing them toward the office. There they began to review papers, computers, contracts. The entire night became an endless succession of questions, calls, trembling signatures. While they crumbled under the weight of their own lies, I retired to my small room in the yard. I sat on the edge of the bed and, for the first time in many years, breathed without feeling oppression in my chest. I heard altered voices in the distance, doors opening, the sound of a printer working in a rush. The most painful punishment wasn't losing money or properties. It was seeing how their power dissolved in real time in front of me, without me having to raise my voice. At dawn, my daughter-in-law was locked in the bathroom, eyes swollen and body trembling. My son walked from one side to the other like a trapped animal. "This is your fault," she murmured, with hate when she saw me cross the hallway. I stopped in front of her. "No," I responded calmly. "This is the fruit of your own decisions." She didn't scream, didn't answer. She lowered her head, defeated. Hours later, I received the call from the lawyer confirming that the process had been admitted. He explained with clear and cold words that there would be a preliminary injunction, forensic accounting, subpoenas. My daughter-in-law listened to every word with her face undone. That woman who had locked me up like a servant now had nowhere to escape. Her name would be associated with scandal for years. Her prestige, her greatest pride, was going to turn into dust. My son approached me when I hung up. "Is there any way to stop this?" he asked with a thread of hope. I looked him in the eyes, searching inside him for the man I once thought he was. I didn't answer. Not anymore. His shoulders sank. He understood at last that some doors, once closed, do not open again. That same afternoon they received the order to temporarily vacate the house. I saw them pack suitcases in silence, taking only the essentials. No one shouted, no one argued. The castle of vanity had collapsed completely. When they crossed the gate, Now, with defeated faces and empty hands, I felt something powerful run through me inside. Not joy, not hate, an ancient dignity returning slowly to its place. I stayed alone in the patio. The sun fell on the pavers I had scrubbed so many times. Everything was in silence. For the first time, that silence wasn't a sentence. It was a beginning. The most painful punishment for them hadn't been losing a house or facing a lawsuit. It had been losing the image they believed untouchable, the power they believed eternal. And I, the invisible 60-year-old woman, had become the relentless mirror of their fall. The silence that remained after their departure wasn't immediate or clean. It mixed for hours with the echo of hurried steps, the rolling of suitcases down the hallway, the creaking of doors closing with trembling hands. I observed everything from the patio, seated in an old wicker chair, watching how the house I had cleaned so many times for others emptied for the first time for me. I didn't feel euphoria, nor sadness. I felt a deep, serious calm, as if finally the world had returned to its axis. As night fell, the phone began to ring. First, it was calls I didn't answer. Unknown numbers, anxious voices on the other side that cut off when voicemail hit. Then came the messages, relatives asking to speak with me calmly, acquaintances saying they didn't agree with what happened but wanted to mediate. Every word was impregnated with a concern that wasn't for me, but for them, for their reputations, for their connections, for not getting splashed by a scandal that could no longer be hidden. The next morning, when the sun barely grazed the patio pavers, I heard timid knocks on the front door. They weren't the arrogant knocks of my daughter-in-law, nor the firm steps of my son from other times. They were insecure knocks, almost pleading. I got up slowly, walked to the door without rushing. I knew who they were. Before opening, I took a deep breath. I knew that instant would also define who I was from now on. When I opened it, I saw them. My son was there with slumped shoulders, eyes red from a sleepless night. My daughter-in-law remained a step behind, without makeup, face swollen, as if she had aged 10 years at once. They didn't speak immediately. They stood motionless, like two defeated figures before a door that no longer belonged to them. I didn't speak either. The silence between us was long, heavy, definitive. It was he who dared to kneel first. His knees touched the porch concrete with a dry sound that cut through the morning air. "Mom," he said with a broken voice, "forgive me, I failed you." I felt that word "mom" pierce my chest with a mixture of longing and a wound that no longer bled but would never fully close. I looked at him from above, without hate, but without blind compassion. She, seeing his gesture, also knelt. Her movement wasn't dignified. It was clumsy, desperate, almost humiliating. "Please," she whispered. "I didn't know what I was doing. Forgive me. I'll give back whatever you ask." Hearing those words from the woman who had locked me up like a slave produced a strange, almost unreal sensation. For years I dreamed of that moment, of seeing her beg. And now that it was happening, it didn't produce the satisfaction I had imagined. I observed both of them for several seconds that seemed like minutes. I saw the terror in their eyes. I saw the loss of control, of pride, of the superiority they had exercised over me. I saw for the first time their absolute vulnerability and understood something with cruel clarity. Their repentance wasn't born of love or sincere remorse. It was born of fear. "Come in," I said finally. They looked at each other with surprise and obeyed immediately. I led them to the living room. No one sat down. I remained standing in front of them like someone presiding over an intimate and irreversible trial. My son tried to take my hand. I withdrew it gently, without abruptness, but without allowing contact. That gesture hurt him more than any scream. "We are ruined," he said with desperation. "The contracts fell through. There are lawsuits, blocked accounts. We have nowhere to go." I nodded slowly. "I already know that," I responded. My daughter-in-law started crying with sharp sobs. "I will change," she promised. "I will be different. You can keep the house, everything. I will clean. I will work. Just tell us." Her words sounded hollow, learned from desperation. I approached the window. Outside, the patio was clean, illuminated by a quiet light I didn't remember seeing before. For years, I began without looking at them. I did exactly what you are promising now. I cleaned, I stayed silent, I obeyed, I waited. And meanwhile, You built a life on my silence. I turned slowly to look at them again. You aren't here out of love. You are here because you no longer have power. My son put his hand to his chest. Yes, I love you, Mom. Even if I didn't show it, he said, crying. I looked at him with a deep, ancient sadness. Love, when it doesn't protect, also kills, I responded. And the wounds you caused me aren't erased with knees on the ground. They moved a little closer, with hope trembling in their gestures. Tell us what you want. Anything, he insisted. I breathed slowly. I didn't want money. I didn't want the house. I didn't want them to ask for forgiveness on their knees. I wanted something infinitely harder to give back. I want my life, I said at last. I want to be a free woman again, not a tool at the service of your ambition. I want to leave this place without feeling fear. I want each of you to carry, starting today, the exact weight of what you did. They fell silent. My daughter-in-law stopped crying for an instant, as if she didn't understand. Does that mean you'll help us? She asked with a thread of hope. I shook my head. It means I will accept the consequences. All of them. Mine and yours. My son bowed again, touching the floor with his forehead. Don't leave us like this, he begged. I observed that gesture that years ago would have broken my will like glass, but now something had changed at the root inside me. I was no longer the mother who sacrificed herself for a son who didn't defend her. Now I was a woman who had finally defended herself. Get up, I ordered gently. Kneeling doesn't repair what you destroyed. They stood up slowly, defeated. You will not live here again, I added, and you will not touch a single thing more in this house. My words fell like stone. They didn't argue, they didn't protest, they couldn't anymore. When they left, they didn't look back. I closed the front door with my own hands. This time it wasn't a confinement, it was a definitive liberation. I rested my forehead on the cold wood and let the tears run for the first time in years without fear or shame. They weren't tears of defeat, they were tears of mourning for everything I had lost and for everything I was finally recovering. I knew the last act hadn't arrived yet, the hardest one, the one that would define not only their end but mine. But one thing was already irreversible. They had known the floor, and I, finally, was standing on my own dignity. When the door closed behind them, the sound wasn't dry or violent like that afternoon they left me locked in. This time, it was a slow, deep, definitive closing, like the end of a stage that would never repeat itself. I stood in front of the cold wood for long seconds, feeling how the echo of their steps was erased forever from my life. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something much bigger. Peace. I entered the house in silence. The dining room was empty, barely lit by the dim light of the morning. The traces of the dinner were still there. Poorly washed glasses, a chair out of place, a crumpled napkin. Everything was a witness to the collapse. I walked slowly through every room, touching the walls like someone touring a place recently conquered. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was walking in someone else's house. That house was also mine again. Hours later, the lawyer arrived. He confirmed what I already sensed. The process would move fast. The accounts would remain frozen, the assets under investigation. My daughter-in-law could never use my name or my properties again. My son would have to answer for every signature, for every silence. I listened to everything with serenity. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. The truth had already done its work. That afternoon, I packed only the essentials. Some old photos, the clothes I really liked, a couple of books I had hidden in my room for years. I didn't carry rage in the suitcase. I carried my history. Before leaving, I stopped in front of the hallway mirror. The woman staring back wasn't hunched anymore. There were wrinkles, yes, accumulated tiredness, but there was also a new strength that no one would take from me again. My son tried to call me that night. I didn't answer. I had nothing more to explain to him. A mother's love isn't erased, but neither does it justify one's own destruction. I had decided to save myself. I went to live in a small rental house near the ocean. It wasn't luxurious, but every morning I woke up to the sound of the waves and a window open to the world. I began to walk barefoot on the sand, to breathe without fear, to sleep without startles. No one shouted orders at me. No one made me feel invisible. I existed again. I learned over time that my daughter-in-law lost the salon, the friendships, the prestige. My son ended up alone, consumed by his own decisions. I didn't rejoice in their fall, but neither did I prevent it. Everyone reaped what they sowed. Sometimes, at night, I sit facing the sea and think about everything I endured and everything that, in the end, I was capable of doing. Hate didn't save me. Revenge didn't save me. The courage to stop being silent saved me. Today, at my 60 years, I can say something I could never say aloud before. I am free. Free from humiliation. Free from fear. Free even from the past. And that was my true revenge. Some months have passed since that night I closed the door with my own hands. I still remember the sound of the metal and how for the first time in years I didn't feel confinement, but relief. I moved with a single suitcase and with my heart trembling like someone learning to walk again. There were days of loneliness, yes, and nights when the past came knocking at the door of my memories. But there were also quiet sunrises, silences without threats, mornings where no one shouted orders at me. I learned that peace makes no noise, but it heals. With time, I went back to looking at myself without shame. I recovered small tastes I had abandoned. Reading without rushing, drinking coffee by an open window, choosing my clothes without fear of mockery. Sometimes I think of my son, and my heart tightens because love doesn't disappear even if it hurts. I also think of my daughter-in-law, of her broken arrogance. And I don't feel resentment. I feel distance. I understood that forgiving isn't always returning, and that protecting oneself is also a form of self-love. Today I walk slower, it's true, but my steps no longer retreat out of fear. I still have wrinkles, but I also have a voice that learned not to be silent. If this story left anything in me, it is the certainty that it is never too late to stand up, even when everything seems lost. Your support allows more voices like mine to find the strength to come out of the silence. And now I invite you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave in the comments what you thought of the story. Thank you for joining us until the end.